The Brawl For All was a tournament held by the World Wrestling Federation in the summer of 1998. This tournament, though, would be vastly different from previous wrestling tournaments held by the WWF, as in, it wasn't a wrestling tournament. Brawl For All contests would be legit. It wasn't scripted, it wasn't fake or predetermined, it was as real as it gets. For many years, people would argue about who the real tough guys in wrestling were, who could really hurt people, who were the locker room hard men, and now we had a chance to see exactly who it was. In the end, industry insiders, the wrestling media, even producers within the WWF itself absolutely hated the tournament, with both Jim Cornette and Bruce Pritchard echoing the same sentiments, saying that the Brawl For All was one of the stupidest ideas that the WWF ever put on TV. I mentioned in my last video that took a look at Steve Blackman that I thought the Brawl For All wasn't as bad as many make it out to be, and I do stand by that. I found it quite fascinating seeing these guys contest themselves in legit combat. That being said, as a kid, I've always been a boxing fan, and I was also drawn to the first lot of UFC shows. On the boxing side of things, I was a huge fan of Nigel Benn, and I remember being captivated by his 2 matches with Chris Eubank. In regards to the UFC, I was introduced to that world when a friend in school had a really bad VHS copy of the second UFC pay-per-view show. The show itself was a tournament, it featured hyper-realistic combat, and it was insanely entertaining. Watching that show made me appreciate submission-style fighting. With Royce Gracie becoming a man, I tried to learn as much about as possible before I even had internet at home. So, with my background here, when the WWF announced this Brawl For All tournament and the promise that it would be legitimate, I was intrigued and I wanted to see what would happen. I followed the tournament closely, and granted, the level of real combat training that some guys had meant that some of these matches were a little wild and uncoordinated, but the Brawl For All also featured legit tough guys who could and would absorb a lot of punishment. I know too that I'm in the minority here. I'm not saying that the Brawl For All was great and it should be done again, far from it. What I am saying though is, at the time, I didn't mind watching Brawl For All matches. I'll go as far to say that I found them entertaining. Sure, they were more like tough men contests, a sort of hybrid of boxing and amateur wrestling that you'd see in a gym. This wasn't the UFC, it would never be on that level, but for what it was, I still thought it was alright. Now, on the flip side of this, I can also see why it was a bad idea on the grand scheme of things, and I can also see its real lack of appeal with wrestling fans, in particular those wrestling fans who didn't care for boxing or MMA. Even fans who appreciated MMA would scoff at the Brawl For All for its lack of refined fighting. But wrestling fans, as I've said before, are some of the most loyal fans in the world, and they bought tickets to Raw in 1998 to see wrestling, not fighting. When the lights got dimmed in arenas and they would see these wrestlers walk to the ring wearing boxing gloves and trying to perform takedowns for points and whatnot, they hated it. Fans loudly booed the fights and chanted "We want wrestling" during these early contests. And fans at home too, more so casual fans, were flat out confused when it came to the Brawl For All. Why are these guys having a legit fight in a wrestling ring when the remainder of the show was all predetermined? With this also comes the fact that many of the Brawl For All entrants, including those that had some fight training, would end up with bad injuries. This makes it hit home really that Brawl For All was indeed a bad idea. Professional fighters of many different disciplines would train for months when it came to in-ring competition. Training camps are utilised for long periods of conditioning and physical activity, and professional fighters would think of nothing but their next fight with a prolonged training regime for preparation. The WWF wrestlers who entered the Brawl For All did not have this, and because of this lack of great preparation, many of the men suffered injuries. 6 entrants got injured, and again, before putting our entertainment to the forefront, this is the main reason why people should consider the Brawl For All a bad idea, not because it wasn't pro wrestling. Injuries are commonplace in legit fights, but when the injuries got so bad that they became career threatening, then it shouldn't have happened in the first place. We will take a look at some of these injured participants a little later on. Vince Russo has been credited as the man who came up with this tournament, with Vince saying himself that it was set up to humiliate JBL. Apparently Bradshaw was running his mouth at every given opportunity in regards to how tough he was, even going as far to say that he was the toughest guy in the World Wrestling Federation. Vince Russo decided to silence Bradshaw by putting him in a legit fight tournament on live TV to see if he could back up these claims. Now, of course, Vince Russo is easy to blame for anything, but we have to remember that Vince McMahon gave this whole idea the green light. I mean, the tournament would take up an insanely large portion of WWF programming for over a month, so yes, Vince Russo's silly idea, but an idea that Vince McMahon fully endorsed. Vince Russo said, "I wasn't a big fan of JBL because I thought he was a bully. I always knew he didn't like me too. We were there one day at TV and JBL makes the comment that if the WWF was like one big bar fight, he would whip everybody. Those words came directly out of his mouth. I'm not crazy about the guy to begin with, and I know there are some pretty tough guys in the locker room, so I let those words sink into my head for a few days. The next creative meeting, I pitched the Brawl For All to Vince McMahon. He loved it. Vince loves that stuff, the real competitive nature and the bragging rights that tapped into his masculinity, something fierce. I didn't have to sell him on it, I didn't have to talk him into it. So there would have to be some sort of incentive here to get guys to participate. You can count out the main event stars. They didn't need the exposure or the TV time, and they were already getting paid well enough. Also, risking your top star to injury or a humiliating defeat isn't the best way to continue their push, so you can count out guys like Steve Austin and The Undertaker. As a way to encourage participation, the WWE paid bonuses per match, which escalated the further you made it in the tournament. The winner received 75 grand. Along with this was television exposure, and if you win the tournament, you'd be thinking that the WWF would have some sort of push plan for you, right? Well, we'll soon find out. So let's look at everyone who entered the tournament. We had 2 Cold Scorpio, Dan the Beast Severn, 8 Ball from the DOA, The Godfather, Mark Merrow, Henry Godwin, Savio Vega, Brockus, Darren Drozdov, Bob Holly, Quebecer Pierre, Steve Blackman, Bradshaw, Road Warrior Hawk, Bart Gunn, and Steve Williams. So why wasn't Ken Shamrock involved? You'd think that the UFC original would have been a hot favourite to win this whole thing, but there are mixed stories as to why Shamrock didn't get involved in the Brawl For All. Shamrock himself said that he was offered a big bonus just to compete, but he declined. Shamrock said, "I chose not to. I worked hard to gain trust in the wrestlers. I just came from the world of fighting and they want me to get into this Brawl For All. I thought to myself, I'm a professional fighter. It's not fair to those guys to get involved because I'm at a different level. I respectfully declined. They were going to pay me $50,000 to fight for real when I'd make over $1 million to fight in something like that. You're not going to give me 50 grand. It was about me being a professional fighter and them being amateurs." Steve Williams, though, says that Shamrock backed out after agreeing to participate in the tournament. Dan Severn said that the WWF refused to allow Shamrock to enter, and they also removed Severn himself after the first round due to his clearly visible advantages over the pro wrestlers involved in the Brawl For All. But this is really up for debate. It was also reported that Severn took an early exit from the tournament due to being frustrated with having to wear boxing gloves, and he also felt he had nothing to prove, but that too is up for debate. You can make your own mind up later. Dan Severn did seem to get quite annoyed during his first round match, but we'll look at that very soon. Speaking of Steve Williams, Jim Ross had brought Steve into the WWF during his days in talent relations, and Jim had spoken extremely highly of Williams. He was picked as the favourite to win the whole thing, which I am baffled by, seeing as Dan Severn was in there, but anyway, the WWF thought that Williams was going to win the whole thing, and their plan was to push a Steve Williams versus Steve Austin feud after the Brawl For All. Bob Holly wrote in his book that the WWF even paid Steve Williams the final prize money after he won his first round match and after Dan Severn had pulled out, but this can't be verified. Needless to say, Steve Williams did not win the tournament. Instead, he was embarrassed by eventual winner Bart Gunn via knockout in the quarterfinals. Steve Williams had made a big name for himself in Japan as a genuine tough guy, but the Brawl For All kind of dispelled this tough guy image. A common misconception is that Steve got injured in the Brawl For All and that was the end of his career. He didn't make any more appearances, but this isn't true. Williams came back in the WWF in 1999 to begin feuding with Bob Holly and Tiger Ali Singh, and Williams himself said that he was again getting prepped up for a Steve Austin feud once again, but he ended up needing to go home to rehab the torn hamstring that he suffered at the Brawl For All, and it was then that the WWF released him. Before looking at the matches, let's go over the typical rules for a Brawl For All match. Matches were contested via 3 1-minute rounds. A participant earned 5 points if they landed the most punches in a round, they would get 5 points per takedown, and they would get 10 points for a knockdown. If a wrestler got knocked out, the match would end, naturally. There was no TKO rule, but of course a fight could end via referee stoppage. In terms of the scoring system, you can see here the takedowns were just as viable as throwing punches. 2 successful takedowns would score as many points as a knockdown, and some fighters, such as Steve Blackman, took advantage of this by going for takedown after takedown. The very first Brawl For All matches then happened on June 29th, 1998. Mark Merrow would take on Steve Blackman, and Bradshaw would take on Henry Godwin, known as Mark Canterbury during this time period. It's funny too that Bradshaw would be featured on the first night. You can see here that maybe Russo and others wanted him to get embarrassed early. Anyway, I talked about the Merrow vs Blackman match in my Steve Blackman video, but briefly, Blackman dominated the match thanks to his ability to take down Merrow. Mark Merrow was a Golden Gloves champion. He had a good boxing background, but his takedown defense was non-existent. This is a good example here of how good Blackman was in terms of smart fighting, but unfortunately, Blackman had to pull out of the tournament after winning this fight due to injury, so Merrow got a bye into the quarterfinals. This first fight got a lot of boos from the audience, but to be fair, the crowd also cheered when Blackman pulled off a few high impact takedowns. If you don't believe me, just go back and watch it for yourself, but at the same time, yes, the fans didn't know what to make of this and just decided to boo right out of the gate. Later in the evening, Bradshaw took on Henry Godwin, 2 big dudes here crashing head on. This fight done an incredible lot to show how disciplined both Merrow and Blackman were in their fight, as Bradshaw and Henry Godwin just ran at each other and started throwing punches in an extremely wild fashion. They didn't try to pick their punches, they didn't try to counter or dodge, they just kept throwing fists like they were fighting in a bar. Bradshaw threw a barrage of punches in the second round, really picking up in the aggression levels, and by the time round 3 began, Bradshaw pretty much had it in the bag. Henry tried to get takedowns in round 3, trying to get some points back here, but it didn't help. Bradshaw wins. Mark Merrow and Bradshaw would meet in the quarterfinals then, and the next set of first round matches would occur on the 6th of July episode of Raw. So the next match we have then is Brockus vs Savio Vega. Jim Ross made a point of reminding fans at home that competitors in the Brawl For All were not boxers and the participants were indeed out of their element in this tournament, maybe trying to save some face after the poor feedback from night 1. The much smaller Savio Vega totally tore Brockus apart in round 1 as Brockus forgot to keep his hands up. He fought a little better in round 2, but by round 3, Brockus was totally tired out and it looked like he had a broken nose. Brockus sustained injuries here to his knee and shoulder, effectively leading to his retirement a year later. Darren Drozdov met Road Warrior Hawk later in the evening, an interesting match thanks to the knowledge we always had regarding the Road Warriors being tough guys. When it came to strikes, Hawk did indeed outclass Draws during the first round, going as far to use feints while picking his punches wisely. Round 2 was a different story. Draws got a few big punches into Road Warrior Hawk, one of which nearly knocking him down. In round 3, when Hawk's mouthpiece fell out, he shouted to the ref to just throw it away, and this led to Draws also spitting out his mouthpiece to try to even the playing field. I don't care what anyone says, watch this back and the crowd comes alive when this small little moment happens, a moment that never gets brought up when people are ripping into this tournament. By the end of round 3, it was hard to pick a winner, and the final decision was a draw. Road Warrior Hawk though got a broken nose during this fight, and he was unable to continue working for the WWF immediately following this fight, so Draws went on to the next round. Notable too about this night, there was no booing from the audience during both contests. The next week then we have the next 2 matches, Bart Gunn versus Bob Holly and Dan Severn versus The Godfather. Bodacious Bart was just too good for Bob Holly. His reach kept Holly well away and Bart just threw big punches from the outside, easily winning the match. Give credit to The Godfather for stepping into the ring with Dan Severn here. Severn was a 5th degree black belt in judo, a 2nd degree black belt in jiu-jitsu. He had won the UFC 5 tournament, he won the Ultimate 1995 tournament. The man was the first and only UFC Triple Crown champion back when the divisions looked a little different from what they do now. He was legitimate, and The Godfather went in there and he tried his best. Remember though that the Brawl For All was not the UFC. Severn was used to using his hands to catch opponents in holds, and he was conditioned in the art of submission fighting, and you could tell this in the first round. Throughout the fight also, Severn would take down the Godfather and keep him locked in holds, with the referee having to plead with Severn to release said holds. The fight went the whole 3 rounds with Severn winning on points, and during this fight the crowd again began chanting "We want wrestling." As mentioned earlier, Dan Severn would not continue in the tournament, and those comments regarding Severn not liking the rules and having nothing to prove, I can kind of believe it. Severn just seemed frustrated during this whole contest, even though he won. The final last round matches happened the following week. Steve Williams versus Quebecer Pierre, better known to modern fans as PCO and Ring of Honor, and 8-Ball versus Scorpio. The 8-Ball versus Scorpio match happened before Raw went on the air. We never have got to see the match in its entirety, but Scorpio won on points. So all those reviewers and creators who talk about Brawl For All and discuss this match, yeah, they didn't see it unless they were there in person. Around 20 seconds of highlights were shown during the actual Raw broadcast. Steve Williams versus Pierre then, and remember, Steve Williams was tipped to win the whole thing. Jim Ross was seriously behind Williams on commentary. He couldn't put him any more over on the headset during this fight. Williams did do well in the first round. He controlled the second with punches and takedowns, and in round 3 he had Pierre totally tired out and the referee stopped the match. Williams, to his credit, looked phenomenal in this first fight here. Quarterfinals next then, and now that you have a good idea of who was involved in the tournament, we can run down the matches a little quicker. The first quarter-final match happened on the July 27th episode of Raw, Steve Williams versus Bart Gunn. Bob Holly said that it was a sellout in the back. Jim Ross had been telling everyone that Steve Williams was going to win this whole tournament, and the boys were watching in the locker room in hopes that Bart Gunn could upset him. Williams got a takedown right away in the first round, but by the end of round 1, the haymakers started coming in. Bart got a good takedown in round 2, so the third round was seemingly the deciding round. Hard to choose a winner again up to this point. Bart scored another takedown in round 3, and when Williams got up, you could tell he hurt himself as he limped towards Bart. Bart then caught Williams with a massive left hook to knock him out. The referee could be heard asking for a doctor as Steve Williams was out cold, suffering the first knockout loss in the Brawl For All. Backstage, the other wrestlers were jumping for joy. Bob Holly said of this fight, "It screwed up their whole storyline as far as Steve Williams working with Austin in the future. The boys all popped when it happened because Jim Ross was going around telling everybody how Steve Williams was just going to walk through everybody, and people were tired of hearing it. When Bart knocked him out, the boys popped." You cannot plan for something like that to work out in your favour, because it won't. When you dangle a 75k carrot in front of somebody, especially a bunch of hungry boys, it's not going to work out like you think it is, and it didn't. It almost wiped out Steve's whole credibility, even though anybody can get knocked out at any given second. And that's why you don't pit the boys against each other like that. It was a bad idea to start with. The second match featured Scorpio versus the Godfather. Severn had defeated Godfather in the first round, and Dan Severn had a quick interview during the entrances where he said he had nothing to prove by continuing in the Brawl For All tournament. Anyway, the Brawl For All got extra ridiculous when the Godfather offered Scorpio his ladies in exchange for letting the Godfather through to the next round. Scorpio refused. The Godfather won on points anyway, so Scorpio maybe should have took up the Godfather's offer. Nothing more to say here. Godfather was better with strikes. The next week then, and first up was Draws versus Savio Vega. Vega was really aggressive in his first round match, and remember, Draws only drew in his first round match, but Hawk allowed Draws to continue on to the quarterfinals due to his own inability to continue on. Anyway, Draws was able to keep Savio at bay. His defense was much better than Brockus's, the man who Savio destroyed in round 1. Draws made sure that Savio couldn't be the aggressor. Draws got huge cheers when he nailed a big takedown in round 2, and Savio got rocked badly towards the end of round 3. Draws wins. The next match on this night was Big Bully Bradshaw versus Mark Merrow. Remember, Merrow had lost his first round match, but Steve Blackman, the man who defeated him, had to withdraw due to a knee injury. To Bradshaw's credit, he knew not to throw wild punches against Mark Merrow like he had done in his first round match, knowing here that Merrow had an amateur boxing background that would seriously work to his advantage. Bradshaw instead tried to go for takedowns, something Merrow struggled with in his first round match with Steve Blackman. By the third round, Bradshaw was trying to place Merrow in holds on the ground, the referee having to scream at Bradshaw to break the holds. The match went to a draw, so another round was announced, much to the crowd's dismay. Bradshaw ended up securing the round with a takedown, but his tactics here weren't very sportsmanlike. He tried to keep holds on, he kept checking the clock to see how long he could stretch his time out, and honestly, I think Merrow should have won this fight here. Semi-finals next, both taking place on the same night, the 17th of August episode of Raw. The first match featured was The Godfather versus Bodacious Bart, and Bart again scored a knockout win. Bart actually looked like he was in trouble in the second round, but Godfather just stopped defending himself moments later and took a tremendous amount of punishment. The fight should have been stopped in the second round. Godfather came out on wobbly legs at the beginning of the third round, and Bart scored the win with a huge right hook. The winner of the next semi-final match, knowing they'd be facing Bart in the final, must have been worried. Drozdoff versus Bradshaw was next, and we knew Bradshaw would do anything to continue into the finals, and this one turned into another wild fist fight. No takedowns were really attempted in round 1. Draws landed some big shots, but in the end, Bradshaw landed more punches. Close call, but Bradshaw scores the win. So big tough guy Bradshaw, the reason why this tournament was set up, goes to the finals. Vince Russo must have been praying for Bradshaw to lose by this point. There was a very real possibility that Bradshaw could win it all, proving himself right about being the toughest guy in the WWF during those backstage tirades. The finals then happened the next week on Raw in the semi-main event spot. Bodacious Bart versus Bradshaw. Bradshaw ran in with the wild haymakers, missing most of them and catching a punch to the jaw within the first 15 seconds, letting Bart score a knockdown. When JBL got to his feet, Bart walked over to him and knocked him out with 2 punches. The big mouth of the tournament, the guy who claimed he could defeat anyone, was soundly destroyed in seconds. Bart gets a cool $75,000 and JBL got $25,000 for coming in second. And that was the end of the Brawl For All tournament. Many predicted, including Jim Ross and Shawn Michaels on commentary, that this would reignite the career of Bart Gunn, and by all means it really should have. For whatever reason, the WWF decided to book Bart into a match with professional boxer Butterbean at WrestleMania 15, a match that saw Bart get knocked out in seconds by the former IBA World Super Heavyweight Champion, totally destroying the name that he had made for himself, and what's more, it was a WWF outsider who delivered the punishment. This was so poorly thought out, and if you are to believe the dirt sheets, it was reported that this match was booked as sort of a punishment to Bart for ruining the Brawl For All plan surrounding Steve Williams. Bart himself said he feared he would get buried for winning the tournament. He was just a low card guy, and here he was throwing a spanner in the works. But whatever the case, the Butterbean match done nothing but make the Brawl For All an even worse idea than what it already was, and it hurt Bart Gunn badly in more ways than one. It's telling that he got released right after this Butterbean match. So in hindsight, yes, Brawl For All was a bad idea. Too many injuries, too many fans who wanted wrestling and not this boxing mixed with amateur wrestling nonsense, and the eventual winner got pretty much buried and sent packing. Should Brawl For All make a return? I think not. If this kind of stuff couldn't get over in the Attitude Era, then there's absolutely no chance for today's modern fans accepting a new Brawl For All tournament. The Brawl For All then remains as a WWF oddity, something that fans and even wrestling insiders use to call out Vince Russo and his bad ideas. But again, I have to stress, Vince McMahon approved it all. So yes, in hindsight, the Brawl For All tournament was indeed a bad idea, but I do still stand by what I said earlier. I did find entertainment in these matches, but yes, I do agree. Whenever we get a full picture of everything that surrounded Brawl For All and everything that happened from the injuries to Bart Gunn getting buried, yeah, this was a bad idea.